Colonel James Harrison arrived at the Pentagon at 4:30 a.m., 3 hours before his normal schedule, responding to urgent communications from the State Department regarding what was being described as a developing diplomatic crisis in downtown Washington. As the senior military liaison for international security coordination, Harrison's involvement signaled that the morning's confrontation had escalated beyond a simple law enforcement matter. The briefing materials Harrison reviewed painted a complex picture of administrative failures, cultural misunderstandings, and potential violations of international protocols. The incident between SWAT Officer Rodriguez and Royal Guard Captain Anderson had triggered a series of diplomatic communications between multiple countries and raised questions about sovereignty and jurisdiction that required immediate high-level attention. Harrison's first call came from the Secretary of Defense's office, requesting immediate analysis of the legal and diplomatic implications of the incident. The royal family member involved was from a strategically important European ally, and any mishandling of the situation could affect military cooperation agreements and intelligence sharing arrangements crucial to national security. The colonel's review of diplomatic protocols revealed that the situation existed in a complex legal gray area. Captain Anderson's status as royal protection personnel provided certain immunities under international law, but these protections were not absolute when operating on American soil without proper coordination with local authorities. Harrison learned that similar incidents had occurred in other allied countries, where differences in security protocols and diplomatic procedures had led to confrontations between local law enforcement and foreign protection details. The international community was still developing standardized procedures for handling such situations in an era of increased global security concerns. The morning intelligence briefing included information about the royal family member's purpose in the United States, which involved sensitive negotiations regarding military technology sharing agreements. The potential diplomatic fallout from the incident could affect these discussions and broader strategic partnerships between the two countries. Colonel Harrison's analysis focused on the sovereignty implications of the confrontation. The Royal Guard's claim that questioning royal security personnel constituted an insult to his sovereign raised complex questions about the limits of diplomatic immunity and the authority of local law enforcement in protecting national security. The Pentagon's legal team provided Harrison with precedent analysis showing that similar incidents had been resolved through diplomatic channels rather than formal legal proceedings. The goal was typically to address legitimate security concerns while respecting the sovereignty and dignity of allied nations involved in such confrontations. Harrison coordinated with State Department officials to develop a response strategy that would address multiple stakeholder concerns. The approach needed to satisfy American security requirements while acknowledging the legitimate grievances of the Foreign Royal Protection Service and preventing damage to important international relationships. The colonel's investigation revealed that Officer Rodriguez's actions, while potentially problematic from a diplomatic perspective, had been consistent with his training and the information available to him. The SWAT officer had responded to what appeared to be unauthorized armed personnel in a sensitive security area, following established protocols for protecting public safety. Captain Anderson's perspective was also legitimate from his cultural and professional context. Royal protection officers in his country operated under different legal frameworks that granted them special authority and status when protecting sovereign family members, even during international travel. The complexity of the situation increased when Harrison learned that the royal family member was conducting unofficial business that could become the subject of formal treaty negotiations in the future. Any diplomatic damage from the incident could affect these potential agreements and broader strategic cooperation between the nations. Colonel Harrison made the crucial decision to formally classify the incident as a sovereign incident under Department of Defense protocols. This designation recognized that the confrontation involved fundamental questions of sovereignty and jurisdiction that transcended typical law enforcement or diplomatic matters. The sovereign incident classification triggered specific procedures for high-level government coordination and international consultation. It also provided a framework for addressing the complex legal and diplomatic issues involved without precedent-setting implications that could affect future international security cooperation. Harrison's declaration elevated the incident to cabinet-level attention, requiring briefings for the Secretaries of Defense and State, as well as the National Security Council. The classification also activated special diplomatic channels for communication with the foreign government involved. The colonel worked with international law experts to develop a resolution framework that would address the legitimate concerns of all parties while establishing clearer protocols for future situations. The goal was to prevent similar incidents while maintaining necessary security standards and respecting diplomatic relationships. Officer Rodriguez was placed on administrative leave pending the completion of the diplomatic resolution process, not as punishment, but to allow for thorough investigation and to demonstrate American commitment to addressing the foreign government's concerns about the incident. Captain Anderson received formal acknowledgement from American officials that his detention had resulted from administrative and communication failures rather than any wrongdoing on his part. This recognition was important for maintaining his professional standing and addressing the dignity concerns raised by his government. The royal family member issued a statement through diplomatic channels expressing appreciation for the American response and emphasizing her continued commitment to the relationship between the two countries. Her willingness to continue her visit demonstrated that the incident had not caused permanent damage to the diplomatic relationship. Colonel Harrison's Sovereign Incident Declaration provided a legal and diplomatic framework for addressing the complex issues raised by the confrontation. It acknowledged that the incident involved fundamental questions about authority, sovereignty, and international cooperation that required careful handling at the highest levels of government. The resolution process included establishment of new coordination protocols between federal agencies and local law enforcement to prevent similar incidents. These procedures would ensure that diplomatic security operations were properly communicated to all relevant authorities while maintaining necessary security standards. Training programs were developed for both American law enforcement and foreign security personnel operating in the United States, focusing on cultural awareness, legal frameworks, and de-escalation techniques for handling situations involving different national protocols and expectations. The incident ultimately strengthened rather than weakened the relationship between the two countries, as both governments demonstrated commitment to addressing legitimate concerns and preventing future misunderstandings. The Sovereign Incident Classification provided a dignified resolution that respected both nations' sovereignty while maintaining security cooperation. Officer Rodriguez returned to duty after completing additional training in diplomatic protocols and international security coordination. His experience became part of training programs for other law enforcement personnel who might encounter similar situations in an increasingly connected world. Captain Anderson received official recognition from both his government and American officials for his professional handling of a complex situation. The incident led to improved coordination protocols that enhanced security for future royal family visits to the United States. Colonel Harrison's decision to declare a sovereign incident created a new precedent for handling complex diplomatic and security situations that involve questions of sovereignty and jurisdiction. The framework developed through this incident became a model for addressing similar situations with other allied nations. The final resolution emphasized the importance of clear communication, cultural understanding, and respect for sovereignty in maintaining international security cooperation. The incident demonstrated that even complex diplomatic situations could be resolved successfully when all parties approached them with good faith and commitment to maintaining important strategic relationships. The lessons learned from the sovereign incident were incorporated into international security protocols and training programs, helping to prevent similar confrontations and strengthen cooperation between allied nations facing common security challenges in an increasingly complex global environment. The embassy's black sedan arrived within 20 minutes of the initial confrontation, carrying officials who immediately began speaking in rapid, urgent tones with the federal agents controlling the scene. Marcus watched from his position near the command vehicle as men in expensive suits emerged and began what appeared to be intense negotiations with the FBI field supervisor. The detained Royal Guard, whose name Marcus learned was Captain Eric Anderson of the Royal Protection Service, had been temporarily released from handcuffs but remained in federal custody. His uniform bore insignia that federal agents confirmed belonged to a legitimate European Royal Protection Unit, making Marcus's actions potentially problematic from both legal and diplomatic perspectives. Captain Anderson stood with rigid military bearing despite his obvious anger, speaking in heavily accented but clear English when addressing the American officials. He repeatedly demanded apologies and threatened formal complaints to both his embassy and the State Department regarding what he characterized as an unprovoked assault by American law enforcement. Marcus learned from his sergeant that the royal family member Captain Anderson was protecting was indeed in the United States for legitimate diplomatic purposes, conducting private negotiations related to trade agreements and cultural exchange programs. The security detail's presence should have been coordinated with local authorities, but administrative errors had apparently prevented proper notification. The situation became more complex when additional embassy personnel arrived, including a senior diplomat who immediately began making phone calls to Washington officials. Marcus could hear fragments of conversations mentioning the Secretary of State's office and urgent requests for guidance on handling what was rapidly becoming a sensitive international matter. Federal agents interviewed Marcus extensively about his perception of events and decision-making process during the confrontation. They emphasized that while his actions might have been justified based on the information available to him, the broader implications required careful handling to prevent damage to important diplomatic relationships. Captain Anderson provided his account of events to investigators, describing his shock at being physically detained while conducting legitimate security duties for a member of a royal family. He explained that in his country, royal protection officers held special legal status that granted them certain immunities when operating in official capacity, even on foreign soil. The cultural misunderstanding became apparent as details emerged. Captain Anderson's refusal to provide credentials immediately stemmed from protocols in his home country, where royal protection personnel were not required to justify their presence to local authorities when protecting sovereign family members. His aggressive response to Marcus's requests was based on his perception that questioning royal security was inherently disrespectful. Marcus began to understand that he had inadvertently triggered a conflict between different legal and cultural systems regarding authority and sovereignty. What appeared to him as suspicious noncompliance was actually Captain Anderson following his own nation's protocols for protecting royal family members during official visits. The media attention intensified throughout the morning as news outlets learned more details about the incident. Television reporters began describing it as a confrontation between American law enforcement and foreign royal security, with potential implications for diplomatic relations between the two countries. Embassy officials worked frantically to contain the situation, emphasizing that the royal family member was in the United States as a private visitor conducting unofficial business, not as part of a formal state visit. This distinction was important because it affected the level of diplomatic immunity and protocol requirements involved. Marcus found himself at the center of a complex international incident that none of his training had prepared him for. The SWAT team's mission had been to investigate suspicious activity, but they had instead stumbled into a legitimate security operation that had been improperly coordinated with local authorities. Federal investigators determined that multiple administrative failures had contributed to the confrontation. The embassy had filed proper notification paperwork with the State Department, but this information had not been shared with local law enforcement agencies responsible for security in the embassy district. Additionally, Captain Anderson's security team had been operating under protocols appropriate for their home country, but inadequate for coordination with American authorities. The royal family member at the center of the security operation remained at an undisclosed location during the investigation, reportedly expressing concern about the treatment of her protection officer and demanding explanations from both American and embassy officials about how such a confrontation could have occurred. Captain Anderson's account included details about Marcus's physical restraint techniques, which he characterized as excessive force against a diplomatic security officer. He claimed that being handcuffed and detained was not only illegal under diplomatic protocols, but also personally humiliating given his position and service record. Marcus learned that Captain Anderson was a decorated military veteran with extensive experience in international security operations. His service record included multiple deployments with royal family members to various countries, and he had previously worked with American security agencies during official state visits without incident. The technical aspects of diplomatic immunity became central to the investigation. Legal experts from both countries were consulted to determine whether Captain Anderson's status as royal protection personnel granted him any special protections under international law, and whether Marcus's actions could be considered violations of diplomatic protocol. State Department officials arrived at the scene and began coordinating with embassy representatives to develop a resolution that would address both countries' concerns. The goal was to prevent the incident from escalating into a formal diplomatic protest that could affect broader relations between the two nations. Marcus received support from his department superiors, who emphasized that his actions were reasonable based on the information available to him at the time. They pointed out that embassy district security protocols required all armed personnel to be properly identified and coordinated with local authorities, regardless of their claimed diplomatic status. The investigation revealed that similar coordination problems had occurred in other cities when foreign security details operated without proper notification to local law enforcement. The incident highlighted the need for better communication systems between federal agencies responsible for diplomatic security and local authorities responsible for public safety. Captain Anderson's anger began to diminish as he learned more about the administrative failures that had contributed to the confrontation. He expressed understanding that Marcus had acted according to his training and protocols, even while maintaining that the physical detention had been inappropriate and potentially illegal. The royal family member issued a statement through embassy officials expressing disappointment about the incident, but emphasizing her desire to continue her visit to the United States. She called for improved coordination between security agencies to prevent similar misunderstandings in the future. Marcus reflected on how quickly a routine security call had escalated into an international incident involving multiple countries, federal agencies, and diplomatic protocols he had never encountered before. The complexity of modern international relations had intersected with local law enforcement in ways that his training had not anticipated. The afternoon brought additional complications as news organizations began requesting interviews with both Marcus and Captain Anderson about their perspectives on the confrontation. Media relations specialists from both countries worked to manage the narrative and prevent sensational coverage that could inflame public opinion. Federal agents completed their initial investigation and began preparing reports for multiple agencies, including the State Department, FBI, and local law enforcement supervisors. The incident would require extensive documentation and analysis to prevent similar occurrences and to address any diplomatic concerns raised by either country. Captain Anderson was released from federal custody, but remained available for additional questioning as the investigation continued. He expressed willingness to cooperate with American authorities while maintaining his position that the detention had been inappropriate and potentially damaging to diplomatic relations. As evening approached, Marcus realized that his morning decision to detain an armed individual in a sensitive security area had triggered a complex chain of events that would likely have consequences extending far beyond his own career and department. Detective Marcus Rodriguez had been with the Metropolitan SWAT team for 8 years, but nothing in his training prepared him for what happened that Tuesday morning in downtown Washington, D.C. The call came in at 6:47 a.m. Reports of suspicious activity near the embassy district, where foreign dignitaries often conducted business under heavy security. Marcus checked his equipment one final time: ballistic vest, communications gear, and his service weapon properly secured. He had a wife and 2 young daughters at home, and every mission carried the weight of wanting to return to them safely. As they approached the target area near Embassy Row, Marcus noticed unusual activity around what appeared to be a temporary security checkpoint. Several men in elaborate uniforms were stationed at intervals along the sidewalk, their presence both formal and intimidating. These weren't typical embassy security guards or local police officers Marcus recognized from previous operations. The team leader, Sergeant Williams, called for a tactical assessment through their radio communications. Intelligence reports indicated that no special diplomatic events were scheduled for that morning. making the heavy security presence suspicious and potentially threatening. In the post-9/11 security environment, any unexplained military-style presence near sensitive government or diplomatic facilities triggered immediate investigation protocols. Marcus positioned himself behind a concrete barrier approximately 50 meters from the checkpoint, using his binoculars to assess the situation more carefully. Through the fog, he could see that the uniformed individuals were carrying weapons and appeared to be conducting their own security operations. Their uniforms were unfamiliar, elaborate dress with gold braiding and ceremonial elements that didn't match any law enforcement agency Marcus knew. The radio crackled with updates from other team members positioned around the perimeter. Jake reported similar observations from his position on the opposite side of the street, confirming multiple armed individuals in non-standard uniforms conducting what appeared to be unauthorized security operations in a sensitive area. Sergeant Williams made the decision to approach and identify the unknown security personnel. Standard protocol required any armed individuals in the embassy district to be properly credentialed and coordinated with local law enforcement. The fact that no advance notice had been given to Metropolitan Police made this situation a potential security breach requiring immediate attention. Marcus and Jake were assigned to make initial contact while the other team members provided overwatch from concealed positions. As they approached on foot, Marcus noticed that the uniformed men carried themselves with military precision, but their equipment and protocol seemed unusual for American security forces or typical diplomatic protection details. The lead figure among the unknown security personnel was a tall man with an impressive bearing, wearing what appeared to be a ceremonial sword alongside modern tactical equipment. His uniform was more elaborate than the others, suggesting senior rank or special position within whatever organization they represented. When Marcus and Jake reached speaking distance, they identified themselves as law enforcement and requested identification from the security personnel. The response they received was unlike anything either officer had experienced in their careers. The lead figure spoke with a distinct accent and claimed to represent the personal protection detail of a foreign royal family member who was conducting official business in the area. Marcus asked to see proper diplomatic credentials and coordination paperwork, as required by established protocols for any foreign security operations on American soil. The response was evasive and increasingly confrontational. The foreign security leader insisted that their presence was authorized under special diplomatic immunity provisions and that local law enforcement had no jurisdiction over their operations. The situation escalated when the foreign security leader demanded that Marcus and Jake withdraw from the area immediately. He claimed that their presence was interfering with a legitimate security operation protecting a member of a royal family during sensitive negotiations with American officials. Jake attempted to defuse the tension by explaining that they simply needed to verify credentials and ensure coordination with local authorities, as required by federal law governing foreign security operations. The response was a firm refusal and a threat to file formal diplomatic complaints if the American officers did not withdraw immediately. Marcus felt the situation spinning out of control. His training emphasized de-escalation, but also required him to maintain security in sensitive areas regardless of claimed diplomatic status. The embassy district had specific protocols precisely because of the complex legal and political implications of foreign operations on American soil. When Marcus again requested proper documentation, the lead foreign security officer stepped closer and placed his hand on his weapon while speaking in an increasingly aggressive tone. He claimed that questioning royal security personnel was an insult to his sovereign and could constitute an international incident. The confrontation reached a critical point when the foreign officer began speaking rapidly in his native language to his subordinates while maintaining a threatening posture toward Marcus. Unable to understand the communication and perceiving a developing threat to his safety and that of his partner, Marcus made a split-second decision that would change everything. In accordance with his training for handling potentially hostile armed individuals, Marcus moved to control the situation before it could escalate to violence. He stepped forward to secure the foreign officer's weapon and place him under temporary detention until proper credentials could be verified and the situation clarified. The foreign officer resisted Marcus's attempt to secure his weapon, leading to a brief but intense physical struggle. During this confrontation, Marcus used approved control techniques to subdue what he perceived as a potentially dangerous individual who had refused to provide proper identification while armed in a sensitive security area. The other foreign security personnel immediately moved to assist their leader, creating a chaotic scene with multiple armed individuals in close proximity. Jake called for backup while attempting to prevent the situation from escalating into a larger confrontation involving multiple weapons. Within minutes, additional SWAT units arrived on scene, along with supervisory personnel and representatives from multiple federal agencies who had been monitoring the situation. The complexity of what had occurred was immediately apparent. This was not a simple law enforcement matter, but potentially a significant diplomatic incident with international implications. As Marcus secured the foreign officer with handcuffs, he noticed distinctive markings on the man's uniform and equipment that suggested this might indeed be legitimate foreign security personnel rather than the suspicious individuals they had originally been dispatched to investigate. The realization that he might have just detained an actual royal protection officer began to sink in as sirens wailed in the distance. The detained officer continued to speak angrily in his native language while repeatedly demanding to contact his embassy and threatening severe diplomatic consequences for what he called an illegal assault on a representative of his sovereign. His subordinates maintained defensive positions around him while shouting in both English and their native language. Federal agents arrived and immediately began taking control of the scene, ordering all local law enforcement to step back while they assessed the situation. Marcus found himself being questioned about his actions while the foreign security personnel were separated and interviewed by agents with apparent diplomatic expertise. The morning fog was beginning to lift, revealing the full scope of what had transpired. Television news crews had somehow learned of the incident and were setting up equipment at the perimeter, suggesting that word of the confrontation was already spreading beyond law enforcement circles. As Marcus stood watching federal agents coordinate what was clearly becoming a major incident, he realized that his split-second decision to detain an armed individual in a sensitive area had potentially triggered an international diplomatic crisis. The weight of the consequences was only beginning to become apparent as he waited for instructions from his superiors, who were now dealing with calls from multiple federal agencies and embassy representatives.